David, we had planned to discuss what Congress needs to do before they recess for the November elections and then what's likely to happen in a lame duck session. I think a lot of our discussion now has been altered by the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And so I thought I'd start there. Just sort of walk us through the next couple of months. So, this is the end of September. What are October, November, December going to look like from a sort of the perspective of the congressional calendar?
Well, it is a little unfortunate that with the passing of such an amazing individual, we have to go into kind of really bare knuckle politics with what's going to happen over the remaining amount of time between now and the end of the year, and now and the election as well. So I just want to say that because she did make an amazing contribution to this country. And I know you feel the same way.
Yeah, no, I think your point's well taken. I've been reading a lot about some of the, her legacy, her legal legacy, starting with, as an attorney and then on the Supreme Court. And, but as you said, we really do have to think about now we're in this bare knuckles politics part of the discussion, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
The litany of amazing accomplishments of Ruth Bader Ginsburg is quite long. And so by being such an amazing force, her passing is also an amazing force. And there's going to be a lot happening between now and the election and now and the end of the year. And there's no way to get around the fact that her passing, leaving that spot open on the Supreme Court, is going to impact it greatly. So let's start with the fiscal year, because you and I both know, and many listeners know, the federal government does a fiscal year from October 1 until the end of September. And we are set to run out of money at the end of September.
It's interesting. I've been curious as to why the federal calendar, the fiscal year, starts on October 1st. And what I've learned is that it used to be on a July to June calendar, but then in the 70s, because they were having trouble getting all the appropriations bills done and just, that it was such a rushed 6 months, they extended it a quarter to start on October 1st, and then that allowed them more time. As we both know now, that's become a challenge. So it's just sort of interesting how, we try to make these adjustments to improve how the processes work. And if anything, I think they get more encumbered, not less.
It does seem to work that way. And it used to be, even when they made that change in the 70s, they were still producing, a set of packages, separate appropriations bills. And those appropriations bills would be done individually for each kind of major segment of the budget between defense and health, human services and Department of Labor. And that has not happened this year. The House has produced almost in a complete set, but the Senate has not taken up any of those bills. So right now, there has to be a continuing resolution of some type to be able to get us through the coming months without the government completely shutting down. We've all seen the government shut down, and it's not a pretty situation, as we all know. And with the politics of this year, I don't think either party wants to be blamed with shutting the government down. So something's got to happen. It's going to happen fast. The question is now, and this question has turned in the last couple of weeks. The question is, do you extend just until mid-December and come back with a lame duck session? Or do you try to get an extension until sometime in February or March of 2021 so that you don't have to have a lame duck session? The common thinking amongst a lot of people in town was that the Democrats wanted the lame duck session so they could come back and really kind of get everything taken care of, with the idea that should they take over the Senate, should they take over the White House, that those changes would be able to move forward. The people would be able to move forward and make new policies very quickly. So now, of course, Democrats are not very anxious to have a lame duck session, because that will probably be when the Republicans bring a President Trump nomination to the Supreme Court up for a vote. So although that remains also whether or not they would wait that long.
one of the sort of calculation that you're laying out for us is if you fill the seat before the election, you may lessen the chance that the president is reelected. But if you delay and say, okay, if we're going to handle it in the lame duck, implying that it would be sort of contingent on the election, recognizing that it doesn't have to be, you run the risk of there not being a lame duck, or that you no longer have, you've lost this one important seat in the Senate. So that is a lot to juggle. And the other thing too that I think is important is that there are always unexpected losses in both the House and the Senate. I can't remember an election where that hasn't happened. And so you could have in a lame duck session members who expected to be reelected who weren't, that are just in a different perspective for whatever reason and how they may behave. So I think that's another sort of variable here you have to take into consideration as you're thinking through, the political situation.
Mitch McConnell has been known to be a very shrewd strategist at playing his hand in the United States Senate. So we shall see how that works, because he also has to deal with something, and Nancy Pelosi, as Speaker of the House, has to deal with something that is also not going away. And that is something you and I have been talking about in the last couple of days, is there is still, as much as there's no real prospect on coming forward at the moment, there's still a lot of pressure to get a new COVID-19 relief package passed.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second, because I think it's a perfect segue from our previous topic. And it's interesting because I would argue that a lot of the likelihood of the president being reelected or the Republicans maintaining control of the Senate is going to depend on the economy. And if the economy continues to move in the direction that it's been moving over the last few weeks, which has been more robust than I think people expected, then you could see a scenario where both the president's reelected and the Senate's and the Republicans hold the Senate. But I also, my understanding, and again, I'm not an economist, is that there needs to be another sort of round of stimulus funding to sort of fuel that engine. So I'm just sort of wondering as to what you think is likely to happen with any sort of COVID-19 relief package.
Well, we just recently had a bipartisan group called the Problem Solver Caucus in the House come up with a COVID-19 package that was, the caucus was 25 Republicans, 25 Democrats. There are a lot of people who are on both sides of the aisle who are vulnerable if something does not happen in terms of a COVID package. So while the economy has turned out to be a bit more robust than maybe some of them thought it was going to be, it's still not. It's still not in great shape. And state and local governments are really, 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 really hurting. And schools are really, really hurting. And also there's going to be, look at the airlines want a bailout package because they're looking at if the payroll support doesn't end, they're looking at starting October, which is massive layoffs. And I'm not saying that to provide any sympathy for the airlines. So I'm just saying there's a lot here that's at stake, and it can get a lot worse, a lot faster than some people I think are probably really getting a look at. So I think we could end up with a situation where we go into the early part of October and it is like, okay, it just all of a sudden got much worse, and there's a big need for something to happen.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because while I said the economy is more robust than people thought, you're right. It certainly isn't even close to robust. And the recent data around, you mentioned the airlines, and the recent data that it looks like there are a number of cases of COVID-19 as a result of people flying. In addition, there's new data that an increasing number of Americans, in regardless of political affiliation, are not interested or are concerned or want to wait on a vaccine in terms of taking the vaccine. So there may be real delays in vaccinating the population. It just seems like those two factors together would push the economy in a negative direction. And then just going back to the comment about the discussion around the Supreme Court. I mean, right now it's an 8-member court, and so while it's a 5-3 majority in terms of the conservatives compared to the more liberal-leaning justices, Justice Roberts has tended to side with the more liberal side on a number of issues. So let's say there's confusion in terms of the results of the election, and that goes to the courts. And then you add a second sort of factor, which is the anticipated spike, and it's already cases in the U.S. are spiking and in Europe, and so that seems likely. And then those two together probably would result in, if there's no package, then it's likely the economy is going to really be in a difficult place. There could be a lot that happens over the next couple of weeks.
Well, let me jump in there, Todd, for a second, if you don't mind. Because you're absolutely right on target. There's a lot happening there that just could cycle out effect. But there's an interesting one that I think is kind of like, well, that's interesting. Right now, the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear the oral arguments on California versus Texas, which is the new name of the case, which was Texas versus United States, which is the one in which the federal judge in Texas declared that the Affordable Care Act was unconstitutional now that the individual mandate which was what the Supreme Court had originally hung its hat on as a taxing provision, which made the requirements constitutional. And now that taxing provision and penalty are no longer there. So they are literally scheduled to hear those arguments a week after the election. So I find it hard to imagine that they are going to occur as scheduled. And I do think there's a good chance that they are going to be involved, like you said, in whatever comes out of this election as they were in 2000.
Yeah, and my understanding is that if the court is 4-4, if it's even, then the lower court ruling would stand, which means that part of the ACA would be overturned.
Well, remember, I mean, the one thing that's a little confusing is that the Fifth District of the appellate courts for the Fifth District in December of 2019 did support the basic finding of that judge in Texas. However, they asked the judge to revisit the case and look at the issue of severability, which you and I know is when the court determines whether something can be taken out of a law and the rest of the law still stand. And that's really kind of the question about how you read this, is whether or not severability comes along and saves some pieces of it. But it's really beginning to be kind of a real long shot at that point.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm trying to balance all of this and sort of think about what has to happen and what could happen. So if we set everything happening with the Supreme Court aside for a second and recognize that it's very difficult to sort of predict how things are going to play out. And I think you make a really good point, which is, traditionally the court starts their session on the first Monday of October. I could see them delaying that a little bit or being a little, having, some sort of tribute to Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it's hard to predict what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks. And then we look at the fact that the fiscal year is going to end on September 30th, and they need to pass a continuing resolution at the very least, or the government is shut down. And do you really want to shut down the government during a pandemic? And so close to the election. And as we've talked about before, it's all the members of the House are up for re-election, 1/3 of the Senate and the president. So it's obviously, it's at stake there. And what the members want is for the term, they want to go into recess sooner rather than later so they can get back home and campaign. And then there's the issues around the relief package. So they have to do the continuing resolution. We'd argue they should do something related to COVID-19 relief. And then in terms of the court, that could go in a lot of different directions in terms of both the court's day-to-day work, but then also identifying a successor for RBG. I guess my question to you, is there anything else that's sort of on the list that Congress may or must do?
I don't think there's anything else that they must do. There's a great deal they probably should do. But like you said, there are those who want to get home and campaign. And I think there are also a fair number who would not mind staying in Washington and doing more work, which they actually think probably would sit better with the voters than just seeing them campaigning when so many things are unresolved. And you talked about earlier about the distrust and concern about the safety of the vaccine. I don't want to underestimate the impact of things like that. I mean, those are things in which the electorate, the voters, are really feeling uncomfortable with the way things are going. And so we shall see. And how to make them happy is not something that I want to necessarily figure out. I want Congress to figure out what they actually need to do, which is, in my opinion, they do need another relief bill. And they do need a reasonably balanced continuing resolution to get us through the end of this year, and then put their question of the Supreme Court out clearly and let it stand or fall independently without it being a part of these other financial pressures. That's what I would like to see.
Well, David, the next couple of weeks are going to be fascinating. And, you mentioned 2020, and I think it's fair to say that it's hard not to anticipate that at least one other major surprise is coming. I won't put you on the spot today to make a prediction as to what that could be, but I do think that's a part of this, that it just seems like every time we have a feel for how this year is going to go, something changes very dramatically and increases the level of chaos, but also makes it harder to anticipate, where things are going to go as we move forward. So I'm just sort of curious as to if that's your sense as well, and what advice would you have for anyone listening to this podcast as they're trying to think about the next couple of months?
Well, first of all, I think that the sale of antacids is going to continue to increase over the coming weeks. I know it will for me. There's a lot of heartburn associated with what's going on for a lot of people, and there's also some real pain for a lot of Americans out there. I think that the most important thing to do is to really step back and be a participant in this democracy, but not let all of the anger and all of the frustration overtake you. And it really, I think is very important for all of us to remember that this is a long, multi-century project called democracy. And we need to stay with it, and we need to stay calm, and we need to really do what needs to be done for the sake of the nation and also for the health of everyone involved during this pandemic.
Well, you have my vote. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Todd.